Before I actually started writing, I had various theories of poetry in mind, and some were diametrically opposite. I was skeptical about all the theories established and prevalent in specific period of time. When one theory of poetry is deeply established, it does not mean that other theories do not exist. They may be at the margin, yet they do exist and make reasonable impact. And all the theories expound different views in respect of form and content of poetry. So these differing views about components of poetry rather confounded me. As I was familiar, rather influenced for different reasons by these apparently irreconcilable contradictory views, I was not sure which way I should go. I had decided I would tread my own path. However, honestly speaking, my poetry is an expression of combined influence of the theories. About nature of poetry and art in general, writers have diverse opinions. Some focus more on form of poetry, while others on object of poetry. Still others combine and balance both form and object. Oscar Wilde wrote, "There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. It is either well or badly written." Somerset Maugham said, "Art is for delight." In my view, the function of any art is obviously to extend pleasure and delight, but we hardly ignore the fact that art represents life. So art, specifically poetry, must not only authentically represent all the aspects of life, but also enhance human life, leading the humanity to spiritually, socially, and culturally more advanced state and stage of life. I found myself closer to William Wordsworth in terms of object and form of poetry, and his philosophy of life in general. His preface to Lyrical Ballads is an expression of his Republican sentiments. For him, then existing social and educational structure was artificial, full of contradiction and hypocrisy. He maintains that nature is the best teacher. He claims that one can find one's lost identity with nature in moments of feeling in which one is penetrated by the sense of nature's huge and mighty forms. In the preface, Wordsworth declared that the book's object was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them, in a selection of language really used by men, tracing in them the primary laws of nature. He clarifies that in that condition of intense passions, they are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Accordingly, such a language, arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings, is more permanent and far more philosophical than that which is frequently substituted for it by the poets. This appealed to me so much. I too, in my poetry, used simple language as far as possible so that even the most ordinary reader could understand it, or to be frank, it was beyond my capacity to use difficult language, nor did I make efforts to make it difficult. I used the language that came to me naturally, the language which was within my reach and range. Although Wordsworth is writing about the common men and the language used by them in a state of excitement, he is not undermining the craft of poetry and the role imagination plays to make it look and sound delightful and enjoyable. He wrote, "To throw over them certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way, and further and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them, truly though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of nature." Wordsworth's definition of poetry also requires thoughtful reflection. He defines poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Though poetry is produced in an intense state of emotion, it precedes certain processes. It requires thought, recollection, and reflection. The poet needs to be calm, quiet, collected, and composed, unperturbed by external interventions. So the making of poetry is not spontaneous. Rather, it is a thoughtful process. All the processes take place in the mind of the poet that gives birth to the ultimate product, what we call poetry. I believe that poetry is written in the state of intense passion, that is the corollary of reflection on ideas and the state of affairs. All this takes place at mental level. Ideas, thoughts, emotions, feelings get processed in the cauldron of the mind. Even if one does not write in meter, yet one has to think about beauty of language, its appropriateness and rhythm. Even Wordsworth agreed to the fact that even if it is the language of common people, it requires certain coloring and refinement. It's true that the best of Wordsworth's poetry is written in meter. Coleridge rightly pointed out this contradiction. In Biographia Literaria, Coleridge claims that it is unimaginable to speak or write in meter spontaneously. The crux of the matter is, writing poetry is a serious activity and requires serious efforts on the part of the poet if they really seek to make it delightful and instructive. Yes, there is some kind of stimulant or trigger that makes one write, but only when one has strong emotive and cognitive sensibilities and extraordinary imaginative faculty. The quality of poetry depends upon the degree of sensibilities, faculty, and the flair that the poet possesses. The more we hone our sensibilities, the better the poetry. It differs from poet to poet, and accordingly we put them into the category of great poets, good poets, average poets, or even bad poets. However, the fact of the matter is that not all the great poets write all great poetry, nor do average poets write all bad poetry. Even in them there is something worthwhile in terms of form and content. Sometimes we find that just a couple of poems or just a couple of lines by the composer makes him her great. But in genuinely great poet we find reasonable consistency. And this consistency in form and content makes them really great. Coleridge deconstructs Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. He disagrees with Wordsworth regarding the statement that there neither is nor can be essential difference between language of prose and metrical composition. He states that poetry requires meter, and metrical composition requires different arrangement of words. I appreciate all the great poets who write poetry in meter, but meter cannot be an essential part of poetic composition. Even simple words, if organized in certain fashion, makes that composition delightful. Yes, there has to be rhythm, but it does not necessarily involve meter, arrangement of syllables, stressed and unstressed in specific number. Metrical composition is not in everyone's capacity. It requires high level of poetic craftsmanship. And those who write in meter, and yet express themselves seamlessly, are truly great. I particularly did not think of meter, it was beyond my capacity. Nevertheless, I sought to maintain rhythm in most of my poems and made sure they produce a kind of melody. While composing, I neither thought of language of common men, nor the language of sophisticated people. I thought more of content than form, although I did not completely ignore the diction and structure. Whatever the language I used, it came to me naturally. As far as the subject matter is concerned, I did not restrict myself to my upbringing. Obviously, there are traces of formative years I spent in the country which I still have fascination for. My education, profession, reading in social sciences, philosophy, attempt to understand fundamental tenets of major religions, and my interest in political discourses transformed me so much. With passing years, many of my perceptions about the universe and life underwent radical change, which is reflected in my poetry. Coleridge's concept of imagination struck me so much. Imagination as a creative faculty involves both aspirations and possibility of our hopes, desires, and dreams. However, Coleridge uses the term imagination as creative power without having any socio-political or cultural implications. We can extrapolate the sense of the expression from his answers to the questions, what is poetry? And what is poet? As he explains, what is poetry? Is so nearly the same question with what is poet? He says, it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity, with the subordination of its faculties to each other, according to their worth and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity, and blends, and as it were fuses, each into each, by that synthetic and magical power, to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. I believe imagination both as powerful creative faculty, as well as a faculty that makes you delve deep into the heart of things. It is a faculty that makes creative genius foresee the possibilities, and also helps us be one with others, having emotional response to things and events happening around us. It is in a way what Shelley suggests, besides imagination being creative faculty. It is the power that makes creative genius transcend self. He underlines the empathetic aspect of imagination which impels the poet to transcend their immediate circumstances and understand the experience of others. This aspect implies obligation of the poet towards well-being of distressed and suffering individuals in the society.